What if time doesn't actually heal anything at all? What if the comfort you feel years later isn't proof of recovery, but evidence of something far more unsettling? What if the pain didn't fade, but was quietly rewritten so you could keep functioning? We grow up wrapped in a promise that feels almost sacred. That time is kind, that it smooths the sharp edges, that if we just wait long enough, the ache will soften, the memories will lose their weight, and the wounds will close on their own. We repeat it to children, we whisper it to friends, we cling to it when nothing else makes sense. Time heals, we say. Time will fix this. Time will make it better. But pause for a moment. Listen carefully to your own life. Does it really feel healed, or does it feel edited? There are memories you know you should remember more vividly, but don't. Moments that once felt unbearable, now strangely distant, as if they belonged to someone else. Faces that once filled your entire emotional field, now reduced to faint outlines. Pain that didn't disappear, but somehow relocated into habits, into fears, into the way your body tenses without warning. Is that healing? Or is that something else pretending to be kindness? Time, as we experience it, is not a gentle river washing wounds clean. It is a force that moves forward whether we consent or not. Physics tells us that time is not an emotion. It has no compassion. At its core, time is simply change, the irreversible progression of states, entropy increasing, systems evolving, information dispersing. Nothing in the laws of the universe says that time should care about your suffering. And yet, something happens inside us as time passes. The sharpness dulls, the memory blurs, the story changes shape. Not because the past moved, but because we did. Neuroscience tells us something quietly disturbing. Memory is not a recording. Every time you remember something, you are not retrieving it intact. You are rebuilding it. The brain pulls fragments, emotions, context, and fills in the gaps with whatever keeps the system stable. Each recall is a rewrite. Each retelling, a subtle edit. Over years, the original file is gone, replaced by versions of versions of versions. What survives is not truth, but usefulness. And usefulness in a fragile human system often means survivability. Pain is expensive. Unresolved pain consumes energy, attention, focus. It interferes with eating, sleeping, bonding, working. From a biological perspective, prolonged suffering is inefficient. So, the brain adapts. It dampens emotional intensity. It disconnects sensation from narrative. It compresses memories the way a computer compresses large files, losing detail to save space, sacrificing fidelity for function. This is not healing. This is optimization. Think about it. If time truly healed pain, why do certain sounds still stop you cold? Why does one smell collapse years into a single breath? Why can your heart race over something you got over a decade ago? Why does the body remember what the mind claims is finished? Because the pain didn't dissolve, it was relocated. What we call healing may simply be the brain learning how to hide the damage well enough for daily life to continue. Like a building with cracked foundations that's been repainted and reinforced just enough to keep standing, functional, presentable, but altered forever. We don't notice the edits as they happen. They're too slow, too gentle, too necessary. No alarms sound when a memory loses its sharpest edges. No warning flashes when your emotional response is dialed down one notch. It feels natural. It feels like progress. It feels like relief. Until one day, you realize something strange. You remember the event, but not how it felt. You remember the person, but not the version of yourself who loved them. You remember the loss, but not the rawness that once made breathing difficult. And instead of comfort, there's an unease, a quiet suspicion, a question you don't quite know how to ask. What exactly did time take from me? And what did it replace it with? Cosmology offers a chilling parallel. In the universe, information is never truly destroyed. It is transformed, dispersed, encoded in different forms. Black holes don't erase information. They scramble it beyond recognition. The past still exists, but not in a way you can access cleanly. The same may be true for you. Your pain wasn't erased. It was scattered across your nervous system, embedded in patterns of behavior, reactions you don't question, limits you assume are personality. You didn't heal, you adapted. And adaptation is not neutral. Adaptation reshapes identity. The child who trusted easily becomes the adult who anticipates loss. The lover who gave fully becomes the one who holds back without knowing why. The person who once felt deeply becomes someone who feels safely, not because time healed them, but because time demanded a version of them that could survive the future. We rarely mourn these changes. Society celebrates them. We call them maturity, strength, growth. We reward people for becoming less sensitive, less reactive, less open. We praise emotional control without asking what it cost. We confuse numbness with peace. We mistake distance for wisdom. But somewhere inside, something notices. There is a subtle grief in realizing that the person you were before the pain no longer exists, not because they died, but because they were slowly edited out, rewritten line by line so life could keep moving. No funeral, no acknowledgement, just a quiet transition into someone more functional, more acceptable, more durable. Time didn't heal you, time shaped you, and that shaping continues even now, as you listen to these words. Memories you haven't thought about in years may be stirring. Sensations without clear sources may be surfacing, not because they are new, but because they were never gone, only stored differently, waiting for the right conditions to reappear. This is the uncomfortable truth we rarely confront. Healing is not the restoration of what was lost. It is the construction of something that can live with the loss, a compromise, a redesign, a negotiated settlement between pain and survival. So, when we say time heals, what we may really mean is this. Time teaches us how to forget just enough to keep going. But forgetting is not innocence, and adaptation is not freedom. As this journey begins, we won't rush toward comfort or reassurance. We won't pretend the edits were harmless. We will look closely, calmly, honestly, at how memory bends, how pain migrates, how identity reshapes itself under the quiet pressure of time. Because before we can understand who we are now, we must first understand what time did to us. Why does the mind forget what the body refuses to release? Why do some memories dissolve quietly, while others cling like ghosts, refusing to fade no matter how many years pass? And what if forgetting was never a failure of memory, but a feature designed to keep you alive? We like to imagine memory as a vault, a place where experiences are stored, waiting patiently to be retrieved, as if the past sits intact somewhere inside us, unchanged, untouched by time. But this image is comforting and deeply wrong. Memory is not a vault. It is not even an archive. It is a living process, constantly rewriting itself to meet the demands of the present. Your brain does not ask, what actually happened? It asks, what do I need to function now? Every second, your nervous system balances on a thin edge between overload and survival. Sensory data floods in relentlessly. Sights, sounds, emotions, bodily signals. To remain conscious, coherent, and capable, the brain must filter aggressively. Most information is discarded instantly. What remains is shaped, prioritized, and often altered before it ever becomes a memory. This means something unsettling. Memory is not optimized for truth. It is optimized for stability. When an experience threatens that stability, when it overwhelms, terrifies, or destabilizes, the brain does not store it cleanly. It fragments it. It dulls the emotional charge. It separates sensation from narrative. Sometimes it hides the memory entirely, not because it is weak, but because it is too strong. This is not malfunction. This is protection. Think about the moments you struggle to recall clearly. Not the trivial ones, but the ones that mattered most. The arguments you replay without remembering exact words. The losses that feel distant yet still heavy. The pain you know was once unbearable, but now feels strangely muted, like sound through a wall. That distance is not proof of healing. It is proof of intervention. Neuroscience shows us that recalling a memory makes it temporarily unstable. During recall, the brain opens the memory file, and when it closes it again, it may not save it the same way. Details shift. Emotional intensity changes. Context is updated. Over time, memory becomes less about what happened and more about what the current version of you can tolerate. This is why two people can remember the same event differently. This is why your own memories change when your life circumstances change. This is why the past feels different depending on who you are when you look back. Memory is not a window. It is a lens, and lenses distort, and distortion serves a purpose. A mind that remembers pain with perfect clarity forever would not survive. It would remain trapped in a perpetual present of threat. Stress hormones would never fully quiet. The body would stay braced, sleep would fracture, focus would erode, life would shrink. So, the brain edits. It compresses long periods of suffering into vague summaries. It removes sharp sensory details. It blurs timelines so the pain feels long ago, even if the body still reacts as if it were yesterday. This is why someone can say, "I'm over it," while their pulse spikes at a familiar sound. Why a smell can unlock panic without a story attached. Why tears arrive without explanation. The narrative memory was softened, but the emotional memory remained, stored in deeper circuits that don't use language. You don't remember the pain. You live around it. This is where the idea of time healing becomes dangerous, because it suggests passivity. It implies that if you wait long enough, the work will be done for you. But time does not do the work. Your nervous system does. Constantly, quietly, without asking permission. The longer time passes, the more edits accumulate. And with each edit, the memory becomes more compatible with daily life, but less connected to its original truth. Not because you are lying to yourself, but because the system prioritizes function over fidelity. A blurred memory that allows you to work, love, and sleep is more valuable than a precise one that paralyzes you. This trade-off is invisible, and because it's invisible, we rarely question it, but something is lost in the process. When memory is edited, meaning is edited too. The story you tell yourself about who you are and what you've lived through shifts, sometimes subtly, sometimes profoundly. The pain that once defined you becomes a footnote, or worse. It becomes a trait. You stop remembering the wound and start calling it just how I am. You say you're cautious. You say you're independent. You say you don't need much. But beneath those words may live a history that was never fully allowed to remain conscious. A story that was trimmed, muted, and refiled so that your present self could operate smoothly. This is how memory becomes identity. Not because it tells you what happened, but because it tells you what to expect. The brain learns patterns. It predicts outcomes. If something once hurt deeply, the system adjusts behavior to avoid a repeat. Over time, those adjustments feel like personality, preferences, boundaries, beliefs. You didn't decide them consciously. They emerged from edited memories doing their job too well. Even forgetting itself can be strategic. The mind sometimes erases not events, but emotional access to them. You know something happened, but it feels flat, distant, neutral, as if it belonged to another life. This is not closure, it is containment. A sealed box labeled, "Do not open unless necessary." And most of the time, it works. Until it doesn't. Because edited memories are stable, but they are not inert. They influence behavior quietly. They shape reactions without explanation. They steer choices without announcing themselves. You feel compelled, hesitant, drawn, or resistant without knowing why. The cause has been removed from conscious awareness, but the effect persists. This is why time doesn't resolve pain. It redistributes it. Some of it settles into the body, some into reflexes, some into silence, and some into gaps, places where memory should be, but isn't. We often praise the mind for its resilience without recognizing the cost. We admire how people move on without asking what they had to leave behind. We reward emotional efficiency. We call it strength when someone no longer reacts. But numbness and resilience can look identical from the outside. Inside, the difference matters, because when memory is edited too aggressively, something vital is lost along with the pain. Texture, depth, emotional range, the ability to feel without fear, the trust that experience won't destroy you, the very sensitivity that once made connection possible. Time didn't take those things. Memory did, under pressure. And yet, the alternative is not romantic. A mind that remembers everything clearly, fully, endlessly, would collapse. There is no moral victory in unbearable clarity. Survival always demands compromise. So, the question is not whether memory should edit pain. It must. The real question is what happens when we mistake that edit for healing. Because when we believe time has healed us, we stop listening to what remains unresolved. We stop asking why certain patterns persist. We stop tracing reactions back to origins. We accept the edited version of ourselves as final, without realizing it was never meant to be complete. Memory was never designed to preserve who you were. It was designed to keep you moving, and as long as movement was possible, the system succeeded. But now, as you slow down enough to notice these layers, these edits, these absences, you may feel something stirring. Not pain exactly. Something quieter. A sense that parts of your story were rearranged without your awareness. This isn't failure, it's insight. And it leads us to the next question, the one most people never ask. If memory edits pain to keep you functional, where does the pain actually go? Where does pain go when it doesn't disappear? If it isn't erased, and it isn't healed, and it isn't fully remembered, where does it live? Most people imagine pain like an object you carry. Something heavy at first, then lighter with time, until one day it's gone. But that image is misleading. Pain is not an object, it's a process. And processes don't vanish, they change form. When memory edits pain to keep you functional, it doesn't delete the information. It reroutes it. Like water blocked from one channel, it finds another path. Quieter, less obvious, but no less real. This is why pain so often outlives the memory that caused it. You may not remember the moment you learned to stay quiet, but you still hesitate before speaking. You may not remember the loss that taught you distance, but intimacy still feels dangerous. You may not remember the fear that once overwhelmed you, but your body still scans rooms as if something could go wrong. Pain moves. It sinks beneath language. It embeds itself into muscle tension, breathing patterns, posture. It settles into habits that feel harmless, even responsible. Over time, the nervous system stops asking, "What happened?" It starts asking, "How do we prevent this from happening again?" And prevention reshapes behavior. A child who felt unsafe becomes an adult who needs control. A person who was abandoned becomes someone who leaves first. Someone who was overwhelmed learns to numb, not consciously, but reflexively. None of this feels like pain anymore. It feels like personality. This is one of time's most convincing illusions. When pain migrates into traits, it becomes invisible. You stop recognizing it as something that happened to you and start experiencing it as who you are. The memory is gone, but the adaptation remains. This is not weakness, it is efficiency. The brain and body are not interested in your emotional story. They are interested in prediction. They build models of the world based on past threat and adjust future behavior accordingly. If closeness once led to pain, the system reduces openness. If expression once caused punishment, the system limits vulnerability. If hope once amplified loss, the system lowers expectation. Each adjustment is small, reasonable, protective, until one day you look at your life and realize it has quietly shrunk. Not dramatically, not tragically, just subtly. Safer choices, narrower risks, familiar disappointments instead of uncertain possibilities. You call it being realistic, mature, grounded. But beneath that calm surface, pain is still doing its work, just in a different form. This is why pain that has been moved often feels harder to confront than pain that is remembered. A memory can be revisited, examined, grieved, but a habit feels justified, a reflex feels natural, a belief feels true. Pain says, "This hurt me once," but adaptation says, "This is how the world is." And that difference matters, because when pain hides inside beliefs, it stops feeling like something that can change. It becomes a rule, a limit, a quiet law governing what you expect from life and what you allow yourself to want. You don't say, "I'm afraid of being hurt." You say, "I don't need much." You don't say, "I learned not to trust." You say, "People are unreliable." You don't say, "I was overwhelmed once." You say, "I like to stay busy." The original pain is gone from awareness, but its logic still runs the system. And the body never forgets this logic. Even when the mind edits memory, the body keeps the score. Stress hormones still surge in situations that resemble past threat. Muscles tighten in anticipation of impact that never comes. The heart reacts faster than thought. These responses are not emotional, they are mechanical. They exist below narrative, below meaning. This is why pain can feel sudden and inexplicable years later. A reaction that feels out of proportion. A shutdown that arrives without warning. A wave of sadness with no story attached. The The mind asks, "What's wrong with me?" But nothing is wrong. The system is responding to an old equation. Pain went underground, not away. Time helped the mind move forward, but it left the body carrying unfinished business. And because the body doesn't speak in sentences, that business expresses itself through sensation. Fatigue, irritability, restlessness, a constant low-level alertness that feels normal because it's been there so long. This is why people often say they feel tired for no reason, or anxious about nothing, or disconnected without knowing why. The reason exists, but it was filed away years ago under the category of things you needed to survive. There is another place pain migrates when memory releases it: attention. Unprocessed pain often pulls attention toward distraction, toward noise, toward stimulation, toward anything that prevents stillness, because stillness is dangerous. It allows old sensations to resurface. So the system learns to stay occupied, productive, entertained, busy. You call it motivation, you call it ambition, you call it discipline. But sometimes it is avoidance refined into a skill. Pain that cannot be felt directly becomes a drive, a pressure to keep moving, a discomfort with rest, a subtle panic when nothing is demanding you. Time doesn't remove this pain. It gives it momentum. And momentum looks like progress. This is why people can appear successful, stable, even peaceful, while still being quietly shaped by pain they believe is long gone. They function well. They cope efficiently. They rarely fall apart. And because of that, no one questions whether something remains unresolved, not even them. Time rewards this. Society rewards this. Life moves forward and the system adapts just enough to keep up. And adaptation, once again, is mistaken for healing. But pain that has moved into structure, into habits, beliefs, reflexes, has a unique quality. It doesn't feel dramatic. It feels normal. And that normality makes it powerful. Because you don't fight what you don't recognize. You don't grieve what you can't name. You don't question what feels like just how things are. This is why the idea that time heals can be dangerous. It encourages us to stop looking too soon, to accept functioning as proof of resolution, to confuse the absence of crisis with the presence of peace. But peace has depth. Functioning has efficiency, and efficiency often comes at the cost of range. When pain moves instead of fading, emotional range narrows. Extremes soften, not just sorrow, but joy. Passion becomes muted. Risk feels unnecessary. Intensity feels exhausting. You feel balanced, but slightly hollow. Calm, but detached. You tell yourself this is adulthood, but sometimes it's grief that was never allowed to finish. This doesn't mean the edits were wrong. They were necessary. A mind that refuses to adapt breaks. Survival requires compromise. There is no version of you that could have carried every pain intact and still lived fully. But acknowledging that adaptation saved you does not mean pretending it cost nothing. Time didn't heal you. Time negotiated with your pain. And the agreement was this: you get to keep going, but the pain will decide where it lives now. As we move forward, the question becomes sharper and more uncomfortable, because if pain didn't disappear, and it didn't stay where it began, then something else had to change to accommodate it. That something was not memory, and it was not time. It was you. If pain didn't vanish, and it didn't stay where it began, then something else had to absorb the pressure. Something had to bend so the system could remain intact. That something was not the past, it was the present. We tend to imagine time as a passive backdrop, an empty container through which events move, seconds ticking, years passing, a neutral flow that simply carries us forward. But this idea collapses the moment we look closely. Time, as lived by a human mind, is not neutral. It is active, selective, relentlessly shaping what is allowed to remain vivid and what must be softened to survive. In physics, time is inseparable from change. Nothing moves through time without being altered by it. Energy disperses, structures decay, information spreads. The universe does not preserve detail out of sentiment. It preserves patterns that remain stable under pressure. Your mind follows the same rule. What survives time is not what is true, it is what is stable. This is why time behaves less like a healer and more like an editor. It trims emotional excess. It compresses meaning. It rearranges the order of significance. It cuts scenes that overload the system and keeps only what can be carried forward without collapse. Think about how a story is edited, not to preserve every moment, but to maintain coherence, to keep the narrative watchable, to remove what slows the pacing or overwhelms the audience. Your mind does the same with your life. The audience is your nervous system. The goal is not honesty. The goal is continuity. So, time doesn't heal wounds. It reframes them. What once felt catastrophic becomes something that happened. What once consumed your thoughts becomes background noise. What once shattered you becomes a lesson, a phase, a chapter. Language itself reveals the edit. Chapters end. Pages turn. We don't say the pain disappeared, we say it's behind us. As if distance in time automatically means distance in impact. But distance is a trick of perspective. A supernova may be millions of years old, yet its light can still reach you now. The explosion is long over, but the effect is present. In the same way, emotional events do not vanish when time passes. Their energy continues outward, influencing everything they touch. Long after the source is gone, the mind simply learns how to live under that light without staring directly into it. This is where time's most subtle manipulation occurs. It doesn't erase the event, it changes the meaning of the event. Meaning is lighter to carry than sensation. Meaning can be intellectualized, organized, filed, sensation cannot. So time converts sensation into story. You stop remembering how it felt and start remembering what it meant. You remember the explanation instead of the experience, and explanations are easier to hold. They fit neatly into identity. They don't interrupt sleep. You say, "That made me stronger." You say, "I learned a lot from that." You say, "It had to happen." These statements are not lies. They are edits, useful ones. They reduce emotional noise. They give shape to chaos. They allow you to move forward without being pulled backward every time you reflect. But something is lost when sensation is replaced by narrative, because sensation is where truth lives. The body remembers in temperature, pressure, rhythm. The body remembers what the story cannot contain. And as time edits memory into meaning, the body carries what couldn't be translated. This is why time can make you feel better while the body remains tense. Why you can logically understand an experience and still feel unsettled. Why insight doesn't always bring relief. The edit happened at the level of story, not at the level of nervous system. Time edits for cognition. The body keeps the original cut. And over years, this split becomes your normal state. A calm surface with subtle undercurrents. A sense that things are resolved, paired with reactions that suggest otherwise. You trust the story because it's coherent. You distrust the sensations because they're inconvenient. This is how time teaches you to side with the edit. The longer time passes, the more convincing the edit becomes. Repetition reinforces it. Each retelling strengthens the current version. The original experience fades not because it was processed, but because it is no longer accessible without destabilizing the system. Eventually, you reach a point where you can no longer remember the unedited version at all. And this is where time's role becomes most profound and most dangerous. Because when you can't remember how something truly felt, you lose the ability to accurately assess its impact. You underestimate what it changed. You downplay what it cost. You misattribute the consequences to personality or fate rather than adaptation. You say you changed because you grew up. You say you're different because you matured. You say life simply shaped you, but shape implies intention. This was pressure. Time applies pressure continuously, and under pressure, systems reorganize. Cracks form where stress concentrates. Reinforcements appear where collapse would have occurred. The structure that emerges is not the same as the one that existed before, even if it still functions. You function, you wake up, you work, you speak, you relate. So the system declares success. But functioning is a low bar. The universe doesn't care if you flourish. It cares if you persist. Time doesn't optimize for joy. It optimizes for continuity, and continuity requires sacrifice. Sometimes the sacrifice is intensity, sometimes vulnerability, sometimes hope. These aren't dramatic losses, they're gradual. You don't notice the moment you stopped feeling as deeply. You notice years later when something extraordinary fails to move you the way you expected. When joy feels quieter than memory promised. When excitement fades quickly into control. You don't panic, you adjust. This is the quiet power of time's edit. It doesn't announce what it removes. It leaves you with a version of yourself that works and asks you to call that healing. But healing implies restoration. This is transformation, and transformation always leaves something behind. As we go deeper, the focus narrows, because if time edited your memories and pain moved into habits and meaning replaced sensation, then the final question becomes unavoidable. What happens when the edits go beyond memory and begin reshaping identity itself? Not who you remember being, but who you are allowed to be now. There is a quiet grief we are rarely taught to name. Not the grief of losing someone, but the grief of losing who you were allowed to be. Because when time edits memory and pain migrates into behavior, something else happens beneath awareness. The system doesn't just adjust reactions, it retires entire versions of you. Not violently, not suddenly, but gradually, through necessity. There were versions of you that existed only briefly, before they became unsustainable. Selves that felt too much, hoped too openly, trusted too easily, reached too far. Selves that were not wrong, just vulnerable. And vulnerability, when it collides with pain, becomes expensive. So, the system makes a decision. It doesn't say it out loud. It doesn't explain itself. It simply stops returning to those versions. The part of you that believed deeply is archived. The part that spoke without filtering is quieted. The part that imagined different futures is scaled back. You don't notice the exact moment this happens. There is no ceremony for the self that didn't survive. Life continues. New routines form. New priorities take over, and because nothing visibly breaks, you assume nothing was lost. But loss doesn't require collapse. It only requires absence. You can feel it years later in subtle ways, in the way you hesitate before expressing excitement, in the way you temper joy before it peaks, in the way you expect disappointment before expectation fully forms. These are not flaws, they are memorials to versions of you that learned the cost of being fully present. Time didn't erase those selves. It deemed them incompatible with survival. In evolutionary terms, this makes sense. Traits that increase pain without increasing resilience are selected against. Sensitivity that leads to repeated injury gets recalibrated. Openness that results in betrayal gets guarded. Optimism that amplifies loss gets restrained. The nervous system learns quickly. It keeps what works. It lets go of what doesn't. But what works biologically does not always align with what nourishes meaning. A version of you may have been deeply alive, even if it was fragile. A version of you may have loved intensely, even if it hurt. A version of you may have felt wonder more often, even if it came with risk. Those versions didn't disappear because they were weak. They disappeared because the environment demanded durability. And durability has a cost. We often romanticize growth as an upward trajectory. More wisdom, more balance, more control, but many forms of growth are actually reductions. Less emotional range, less spontaneity, less permeability. You don't become more, you become more manageable. You call this maturity. But maturity is often grief with a schedule. It's the acceptance that certain ways of being are no longer allowed. Not because they're impossible, but because they're unsafe. And safety, once prioritized, becomes non-negotiable. This is why people sometimes feel nostalgia for past versions of themselves, even when their lives are objectively better now. They miss a self that no longer fits, a self that felt bigger, brighter, more uncontained. Not because it was perfect, but because it was unedited. And here is the most difficult part to confront. Those selves didn't just fade naturally. They were actively phased out. Every time you chose restraint over expression. Every time you chose logic over feeling. Every time you chose self-protection over openness. Each choice was reasonable, necessary, adaptive. But adaptation accumulates, and eventually, you become someone who would not have made the same choices your younger self made, not because you're wiser, but because you're operating under different constraints. Constraints installed quietly by time and reinforced by memory edits. You don't feel betrayed by this process. You feel normal. That's the genius of it. The system doesn't let you miss what it removed too intensely. It leaves you with just enough memory to function, but not enough to mourn fully. The loss remains abstract, unclear, a sense that something is different without a clear reference point. You say, "I'm not the same person anymore," and move on. But the truth is more specific. You are the version of yourself that could survive what happened. Nothing more, nothing less. This is not a condemnation. It is a fact. Time didn't ask what kind of person you wanted to be. It responded to what kind of person could endure the future with minimal breakdown. The self that remained was the one that fit, and the ones that didn't fit were left behind. They don't haunt you loudly. They appear in fleeting moments, in music that stirs something you can't place, in old photos that feel unfamiliar, in rare moments of openness that feel strangely dangerous, like you're breaking an unspoken rule. That rule is simple. Don't become what you once were, because the system remembers why that version was retired, even if you don't. This is the hidden cost of time's edits. Not just softened pain, but narrowed possibility. You don't just forget what hurt. You forget what you were capable of before the hurt taught you restraint. And yet, the story doesn't end here, because even retired versions leave traces. They influence longing. They shape dissatisfaction. They create a subtle ache that no external success quite resolves. A sense that something essential was traded away without a proper accounting. As we continue, we move toward an even more uncomfortable realization, because if entire versions of you were phased out to keep you functioning, then what you call closure may not be resolution at all. It may be something else entirely. Closure is one of the most comforting ideas we have. It promises an ending, a clean edge, a sense that something has been fully dealt with and safely put away. We imagine it like closing a door. Once shut, the room behind it no longer matters. But if you listen closely to how closure actually feels, it's rarely relief. It's quiet, flat, muted, less like peace and more like absence. What if closure isn't the resolution of pain at all? What if it's the final stage of editing, where the system decides the story has been simplified enough to stop revisiting? Then true resolution would imply integration. It would mean the experience has been metabolized fully, its energy redistributed in a way that no longer creates tension. But most of what we call closure isn't integration, it's compression. Think of how digital systems handle overwhelming amounts of data. They don't process every detail endlessly. They reduce file size. They discard information deemed non-essential. They preserve just enough structure to keep the file usable. What's lost is fidelity. What's gained is efficiency. Closure works the same way. Over time, the emotional file becomes smaller. Sharper sensations are removed. Contradictions are smoothed out. Complexity is flattened into a clean narrative you can repeat without activating the nervous system too strongly. The story becomes easier to tell and easier to believe. You say, "I've made peace with it." But peace here doesn't mean harmony. It means silence. You stop asking questions that have no satisfying answers. You stop touching emotional edges that still feel unstable. You stop revisiting moments that threaten to reopen sensations your system no longer wants to feel. This is not denial, it's maintenance. Because unresolved complexity is dangerous to a system built for continuity. If the story keeps changing, the system can't predict. If meaning remains unstable, the nervous system stays alert. Closure stabilizes the narrative, even if it doesn't honor the full truth. And the mind prefers a stable story over an accurate one. This is why closure often arrives not with insight, but with fatigue. You don't suddenly understand everything. You simply run out of energy to keep engaging with it. The system decides it's time to move on, not because the work is done, but because the cost of continuing is too high. You stop feeling pulled back. You stop replaying. You stop questioning. And this feels like healing. But notice what's missing. There is often no sense of completion, no deep settling, just distance, emotional distance, a sense that the event is no longer part of your active inner life. It's not resolved, it's archived. The archive is labeled closed. This is why closure can coexist with sudden emotional spikes, a dream that reactivates everything, a song that cracks the seal, a moment of vulnerability that brings tears you didn't expect. If closure were true resolution, these leaks wouldn't happen. But compression always leaks under pressure. What was removed was not the emotional charge itself, but your access to it. The system didn't heal the wound, it built walls around it. Walls are useful, they keep things contained. They prevent constant intrusion, but they also isolate. They cut off parts of your inner landscape from conscious awareness. And over time, you forget what's behind them, not because it disappeared, but because visiting it became unnecessary for survival. This is why people can live functional lives while feeling strangely disconnected from their own depth. They aren't empty. They are partitioned. Closure doesn't restore wholeness. It restores usability, and usability is what time optimizes for. From an evolutionary standpoint, this makes perfect sense. A human who endlessly revisits unresolved pain becomes inefficient. They hesitate. They withdraw. They fail to act. So the system learns to create psychological endpoints, moments where it simply stops returning to the material. These endpoints feel final. They feel decisive. They feel like growth. But they are not neutral. Each closed chapter reduces emotional bandwidth. Each archived pain narrows the range of feelings that feel safe to access. You don't just stop feeling the bad, you stop risking the good. Because the system learns a simple rule: intensity leads to cost. So, intensity is avoided. This is where closure quietly reshapes desire. You don't want as much. You don't reach as far. You don't imagine as vividly. Not because life disappointed you, but because your system learned that strong attachment increases future editing costs. This is why closure can feel peaceful but unsatisfying. Why calm can feel dull. Why stability can feel strangely hollow. The system succeeded in reducing disturbance, but in doing so, it reduced amplitude. Life continues, but at a lower volume. We rarely talk about this because society rewards closure. We praise people who move on. We admire emotional containment. We equate restraint with strength. And in many contexts, it is strength. But strength achieved through compression is not the same as strength achieved through integration. One hides the wound, the other transforms it. Time, left on its own, favors hiding, because hiding is faster. This doesn't mean closure is wrong. Without it, many people would never function again. It is a necessary adaptation. But mistaking it for healing prevents deeper awareness. It stops the inquiry too early. It convinces you that the current version of you is the final one. But the body knows otherwise. The body knows what was compressed. It holds tension where emotion was restricted. It carries fatigue where feeling was curtailed. It signals dissatisfaction when life feels too small for what was once possible. These signals are not failures. They are reminders. Reminders that what was closed was not resolved, only contained. And containment, while useful, is never the end of the story, because there are memories that resist compression. Experience is too intense, too formative, too deeply embedded to be archived cleanly. Time can edit them, blur them, reframe them, but it cannot fully neutralize them. They remain active beneath the surface, waiting for the conditions that allow them to resurface, which leads us to the next fracture in the illusion. Why do certain memories refuse to stay closed, no matter how much time passes? Why do some memories refuse to stay in the past? Why do certain moments feel closer than yesterday, while entire years dissolve into blur? Why does time seem selective, gentle with some experiences, ruthless with others? There are memories that obey the edit. They soften. They lose edges. They become manageable stories you can revisit without consequence. And then there are memories that resist. They don't fade the way they're supposed to. They don't respond to reassurance. They don't stay where you put them. They break through. You can be calm for years, stable, even content, until one sound, one phrase, one look collapses the distance. Suddenly your body reacts as if no time has passed at all. The heart races, the chest tightens, the world narrows. And for a brief moment, the past is not behind you. It's happening now. This isn't because you failed to heal. It's because some experiences exceed the system's capacity to edit them. In physics, there are events so energetic they leave permanent imprints. Gravitational waves ripple through space-time long after their source has vanished. The event is over, but the distortion remains. Trauma works the same way. Certain experiences warp the internal landscape so deeply that time cannot smooth them out completely. These are not just memories, they are structural changes. They alter how the nervous system calibrates safety, how the brain predicts threat, how attention allocates resources. They are encoded not as stories, but as conditions. This is why they feel timeless. A traumatic memory doesn't feel old because it was never placed properly in the timeline. The brain couldn't integrate it into a coherent before and after. It happened too fast, too intensely, too overwhelmingly. So, it remains suspended, unfiled, uncontained. Time can't edit what was never fully processed. Instead, it builds around it. The mind learns to avoid certain pathways, to steer attention away, to create routines that reduce the chance of activation. Life becomes organized around the absence of triggers, and when that organization works, the memory stays quiet. But quiet is not gone. The memory remains active beneath awareness, influencing behavior indirectly. It shapes decisions. It limits risk. It guides avoidance. And because these patterns feel logical, even wise, you don't question their origin until something bypasses the filters. This is why traumatic memories often return through the body, not the mind. A sudden sensation, a wave of emotion without narrative, a reflexive reaction that feels disproportionate. Language fails here because language was never the storage medium. The body doesn't remember in words, it remembers in readiness, and readiness does not age. Time passes, but readiness remains calibrated to the conditions of the original event. The system doesn't ask whether the threat is still present. It only knows that it once was, and that was enough. This reveals something unsettling. Time cannot heal what it cannot touch. Time edits memory by changing meaning, context, narrative. But trauma bypasses narrative. It lodges itself in circuits designed for survival, not reflection. These circuits don't respond to reassurance. They respond to pattern recognition. You can tell yourself you're safe. Your body may not agree. This is why insight alone often fails. Why understanding the origin of pain doesn't automatically dissolve it. Why therapy can feel slow, circular, frustrating. You're not dealing with a story that needs revision. You're dealing with a system that learned something once and refuses to unlearn it without direct evidence. Time passing is not evidence. In fact, time can make this worse. As years go by, the mismatch grows between who you are now and how your system reacts. You start questioning yourself. You wonder why something so long ago still affects you. You feel embarrassed by reactions you can't explain. You judge yourself for not being over it. But the system isn't broken. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do. It learned a rule under extreme conditions and never received a convincing update, because updates require exposure, presence, safety. And those conditions are rare when avoidance has been optimized for years, so the memory waits, not actively, patiently, waiting for a moment when the filters drop, when attention slows, when control loosens, when stillness creates space. That's when it surfaces, often unexpectedly, often inconveniently. This is why some people fear quiet, fear rest, fear intimacy, fear unstructured time. Because when the noise stops, the system no longer has enough input to maintain suppression, and suppression is effortful. Time can make suppression efficient, but it can't make it permanent. Energy leaks, attention slips, life changes, and the memory resurfaces, not because it wants to hurt you, but because it was never resolved. This challenges one of our deepest assumptions. We assume that persistence of pain means weakness, failure, inability to let go. But what if persistence simply means accuracy? What if certain experiences are not meant to fade, because fading would erase information the system considers essential for survival? From this perspective, trauma is not the mind refusing to move on, it's the mind refusing to forget. Forgetting too much would be dangerous, so time compromises. It allows distance in thought, but not in reaction. It lets the mind believe the past is over, while the body stays prepared just in case it isn't. This compromise keeps you functional, but divided. Part of you lives in the present. Part of you remains stationed in the past. And this division becomes the background tension of your life. Subtle, constant, easy to ignore. Until it isn't. This is where many people begin to sense that something deeper is at work. That time didn't simply heal or fail to heal, but made choices. Chose which memories to soften and which to preserve intact. Chose which versions of you could exist and which had to be restrained. And this leads us to a realization that cuts deeper than memory itself. If certain experiences could not be edited, then something else had to change to accommodate them. Not the memory, not the pain, but the structure of who you are. When memory cannot be edited enough, when pain resists compression, when the past refuses to stay contained, the system makes a deeper adjustment. It doesn't change the memory anymore. It changes you. This is the point most people never consciously notice. There is no clear before and after, no dramatic shift you can point to. Identity doesn't fracture loudly. It reconfigures quietly, like a structure reinforcing itself around a fault line. At first, it feels like adaptation. You respond differently. You avoid certain situations. You speak with more caution. You choose predictability over intensity. These feel like reasonable decisions, mature decisions, and they are. But over time, these responses stop feeling like choices and start feeling like traits. You don't say, "I learned to hold back." You say, "I'm just not that kind of person." You don't say, "My nervous system avoids closeness." You say, "I value independence." You don't say, "Strong emotion overwhelms me." You say, "I'm a logical thinker." This is how identity absorbs pain. Identity is not something fixed that exists independent of experience. It is an interface, a set of patterns that allow you to navigate the world without constant recalibration. When experiences are too disruptive to process directly, identity changes, so the disruption no longer registers as a problem. You don't feel broken, you feel consistent. Consistency is comforting. It gives the illusion of stability. It tells you who you are, what you like, what you avoid, what you believe. And once identity stabilizes, the system relaxes. The work of constant editing slows. This feels like resolution, but it isn't resolution, it's accommodation. Think of a building constructed on unstable ground. If the ground shifts repeatedly, the structure can't keep repairing the foundation forever. At some point, the design itself changes. Weight is redistributed. Certain floors are closed off. Some areas become inaccessible, not because they don't exist, but because entering them risks collapse. Your identity does the same. Parts of you become off-limits. Certain emotional ranges are avoided. Certain desires are downplayed. Certain ways of relating are quietly removed from the menu. You don't mourn them because you stop noticing their absence. The system makes sure of that. And this is where time's influence becomes nearly invisible. Years pass. Life continues. New experiences accumulate on top of the adapted structure. The original pain feels distant, even irrelevant. You might believe it no longer defines you, but it does. Just not in the way you expect. It defines the shape of your boundaries. It defines the ceiling of your emotional intensity. It defines how much uncertainty you can tolerate before retreating. This is not pathology. It's logic. The nervous system remembers what it took to keep you alive. Identity becomes a map of what was survivable. And once that map is drawn, you stop questioning the territory it excludes. This is why people can feel strangely constrained without knowing why. Why they feel capable in some areas and blocked in others. Why certain opportunities feel exciting, but also vaguely threatening. Why stepping outside familiar patterns feels like danger rather than possibility. The danger isn't imaginary. It's historical. The system isn't afraid of the future. It's protecting you from a repetition of the past. So, it narrows the range of selves you can inhabit. You may still function well, you may even succeed, but the version of success you pursue is filtered through adaptation. You aim for stability rather than expansion, control rather than surrender, safety rather than depth. And because this feels sensible, you rarely question it. But something inside you does. It shows up as restlessness, as dissatisfaction that success doesn't quiet, as a sense that life is slightly dimmer than it should be. Not tragic, just muted. You might tell yourself you're grateful, and you are. But gratitude doesn't erase the quiet awareness that something essential was traded away. This is the price of identity-level adaptation. Memory-level edits affect what you recall. Identity-level edits affect what you allow yourself to become. And once identity changes, the edits become self-reinforcing. You seek experiences that confirm who you are now. You avoid experiences that challenge the structure. You interpret the world through a lens shaped by past threat. Time didn't heal you. Time taught you how to be someone who wouldn't break again. This is why revisiting old pain can feel destabilizing even after years of apparent peace. It threatens not just memory, but identity. It challenges the architecture that has kept you functional. The system resists this, not because it hates truth, but because it fears collapse. And yet, the story is not entirely closed, because identity, unlike memory, is not static. It feels fixed, but it isn't. It is maintained through repetition, reinforcement, and avoidance, which means it can also shift, slowly, carefully, intentionally. But before that becomes possible, something else must be acknowledged, because there is a cost to becoming this version of yourself. a cost that often goes unnamed because it hides behind functionality. The cost is not pain. The cost is range. As we move forward, we come to the question that sits beneath everything we've explored so far. What did it cost you to keep functioning, and was the price ever fully revealed to you? We'll face that question next. Functioning is a strange word. It sounds neutral, practical, almost admirable. It implies stability, capability, resilience. When someone is functioning, we assume they're fine, or at least fine enough. We stop asking questions. We stop worrying. But functioning is not the same as living. Functioning is the minimum requirement a system must meet to continue operating. It says nothing about richness, depth, or fulfillment. A machine functions. A structure functions. A person can function while slowly losing access to what once made life feel expansive. And this is where the real cost begins to surface. Because when time edits memory, when pain migrates into habits, when identity reshapes itself around survival, functioning becomes the goal, not because you chose it, but because everything else felt too risky. You learn how to manage yourself, how to regulate reactions, how to stay within acceptable limits. You become reliable, predictable, capable. You show up. You do what needs to be done. And from the outside, this looks like success, stability, growth. Inside, it feels quieter, not empty, not broken, just narrower. This narrowing doesn't announce itself as loss. It presents itself as wisdom. You stop chasing things that once mattered deeply. You stop hoping as intensely. You stop risking emotional extremes. And you tell yourself, this is balance. But balance achieved through avoidance is not equilibrium. It's containment. Containment keeps things from spilling over. It prevents breakdowns. It reduces volatility. But it also limits movement. You can't expand what is tightly contained. You can't feel fully what you're constantly managing. This is the trade time offers you. You get stability. You give up amplitude. You stop experiencing devastating lows, but you also stop reaching transcendent highs. You become even, regulated, safe. And because safety feels good compared to chaos, you rarely question what it replaced. But something in you remembers. It remembers moments of intensity, not just pain, but aliveness. Moments when emotions moved freely, when connection felt electric, when meaning felt immediate and undeniable. Those moments may have hurt later, but they were vivid. They mattered. Functioning smooths those edges. It teaches you to approach life with caution, to keep emotions within tolerable ranges, to prefer certainty over wonder. You don't notice the shift because it happens gradually, and because everyone around you is doing the same thing. This becomes the unspoken agreement of adulthood. We will function, we will cope, and we will call that healing. But coping is not transformation. It is endurance. Endurance keeps you alive, but it doesn't tell you what you're living for. This is why so many people feel restless in stable lives, why achievement doesn't quiet dissatisfaction, why comfort doesn't erase longing. The system succeeded at preventing collapse, but it never promised fulfillment. Fulfillment requires openness. Openness requires risk, and risk is what time taught you to minimize. You may have noticed how quickly your system now flags danger, how easily you sense when something might cost too much emotionally. You withdraw before impact. You adjust expectations. You protect yourself preemptively. This is intelligence, but it is also loss, because the parts of life that feel most meaningful, connection, creativity, intimacy, purpose, are inherently destabilizing. They disrupt equilibrium. They demand vulnerability. They expose you to uncertainty. A system optimized for functioning avoids disruption. So you find substitutes. Productivity instead of passion. Comfort instead of joy. Distraction instead of depth. These substitutes work. They keep you busy. They keep you regulated. They keep you moving. And because movement continues, the system believes it made the right choice. But movement without direction eventually becomes exhaustion. This is where the cost of functioning becomes undeniable, not in dramatic breakdowns, but in quiet fatigue, a tiredness that rest doesn't fix, a sense that you're maintaining something rather than inhabiting it, a life that feels managed instead of lived. You might tell yourself you're grateful, and you are. Gratitude and grief can coexist. Thankfulness does not cancel longing. Appreciation does not erase the sense that something essential was exchanged without your full awareness. Time never explained the terms of the agreement. It didn't say, to keep going, you will need to become smaller in certain ways. It didn't say, to avoid pain, you will need to limit joy. It didn't say, to function, you will need to forget parts of yourself. It simply applied pressure. And under pressure, systems adapt. You adapted, and adaptation saved you. But survival is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of a deeper question. Because once survival is secured, something else starts to whisper. Is this all there is? That question doesn't mean you're ungrateful. It means you're aware that functioning has a ceiling, a point beyond which it cannot go. A life perfectly optimized for stability may lack the very qualities that make existence feel meaningful. This is not a call to abandon safety or undo adaptation recklessly. Those adaptations exist for a reason. They protected you when nothing else could. But protection is not purpose. Time helped you survive. It helped you endure. It helped you continue. But it never asked whether you were still becoming. As we approach the end of this journey, we come to the final question, the one that ties everything together. If time didn't heal you, if it edited you so you could function, then who are you now, really? And what might still be possible if you stopped mistaking survival for completion? We'll sit with that in the final segment. If time didn't heal you, if it didn't erase the pain, only rearranged it, if it didn't restore who you were, but reshaped who you became, then the final question is not about the past at all. It's about the present. Who are you now, really, not as a story you tell, but as a structure that emerged under pressure? Most people never pause long enough to ask this. Life keeps moving, responsibilities accumulate, days fill themselves, and functioning becomes so familiar that it feels like identity. You stop distinguishing between who you are and who you had to become. But there are moments, quiet, unguarded moments, when the distinction surfaces, when you realize you are skilled at enduring, but uncertain how to expand, when you notice how quickly you regulate emotion instead of inhabiting it, when you feel calm, yet faintly disconnected from your own depth. These moments are not failures, they are signals. Signals that time did its job too well. Time gave you continuity. It gave you stability. It gave you a version of yourself that could keep going. But time never promised wholeness. Wholeness requires integration. It requires bringing edited parts back into awareness, not to relive pain, but to acknowledge what was altered, what was compressed, what was left behind. Not to undo adaptation, but to see it clearly. Because what you cannot see, you cannot choose. And much of who you are now was never consciously chosen. It was assembled under constraint, designed to avoid collapse, calibrated for survivability. Effective. Impressive even. But survivability is not the same as authenticity. Authenticity is not about returning to who you were before the pain. That person existed in a different world, under different conditions. They are not recoverable, and they don't need to be. Nothing meaningful comes from romanticizing a self that had not yet been tested. The question is not, how do I go back? The question is, what did I become, and why? When you look at yourself through this lens, compassion becomes possible. You stop judging your limits as flaws. You stop shaming your caution. You stop resenting your restraint. You recognize them as solutions, brilliant, necessary solutions to problems you once faced. And then something shifts, because once solutions are recognized as solutions, they no longer have to pretend they're permanent truths. You can thank them without letting them run everything. This is where time's influence can finally be renegotiated, not by force, not by rebellion, but by awareness. Awareness loosens what pressure locked into place. Awareness doesn't erase pain, but it changes your relationship to it. Pain no longer has to hide inside habits. Memory no longer has to remain fragmented. Identity no longer has to stay rigid. Not all at once, not completely, but enough. Enough to feel range again. Range does not mean chaos. It does not mean reopening every wound or dissolving every boundary. It means allowing yourself to feel more than what is strictly necessary to function. It means letting life move you again, not just pass through you safely. Time taught you how to endure. Awareness teaches you how to choose. And choice is where healing actually begins. If healing is defined not as forgetting, but as integration. Not as erasure, but as expansion. Not as silence, but as the capacity to hold complexity without shutting down. You may never recover every detail that was edited out. Some memories will remain blurred. Some sensations will never fully resolve. Some versions of you will stay in the past. That's not failure. That's reality. But you don't need perfect recall to live honestly. You don't need unfiltered pain to live deeply. You only need enough awareness to stop mistaking adaptation for destiny. Time rewrote you so you could keep going. That was its role. What you do now, how you live, how you feel, how much of yourself you allow to exist. That part is no longer time's decision, it's yours. And maybe that is the quiet truth hidden beneath the comforting lie we were told. Time doesn't heal you. Time keeps you alive. Healing, real healing, begins when you notice who you became in the process and decide, gently, consciously, what you want to carry forward. Not because the past demands it, not because pain insists, but because you are no longer just surviving. You are here,